Her fingers traced the laminated menu, while her eyes never really stopped on the specials page. The waiter approached, and she said the dish name before she could consider another option. It was the same meal she had eaten dozens of times, more out of habit than hunger. And yet the moment of decision carried a tiny, quiet relief she never stopped to question. Why does the brain reward us with a whisper of safety simply for choosing what we already know? Most people have stood in a familiar grocery store aisle and reached for the same brand of cereal without thinking. The feeling is not excitement, just the absence of the low-level buzz that novelty can bring. Psychologists call this the mere exposure effect, a tendency to prefer things simply because we have encountered them before. The effect operates below conscious awareness, often without any memory of the earlier exposures. It shapes preferences for songs, faces, logos, and even the sound of a person's voice. But the preference for the familiar does more than guide taste. It acts as a kind of emotional shortcut for safety. It is easy to assume that familiar things feel safe because they have already proven themselves harmless. A food you ate without getting sick, a street you walked down without incident, each repetition becomes a data point that says holding steady is fine. But this explanation breaks down when you look closely at what the familiar choice has actually provided. At the restaurant, her go-to dish was never the most delicious, and once it even gave her a mild stomachache. Yet the next time she sat down, her hand still moved toward the same name on the menu. So the feeling of safety cannot come solely from a clean record of good outcomes. Something deeper is happening inside the machinery of the mind. One powerful explanation points to processing fluency, the ease with which the brain recognizes and categorizes incoming information. Familiar stimuli travel along well-rehearsed mental pathways, requiring less effort to understand. That effortless processing feels good, and the brain mistakenly tags it as a signal that this thing is true, likable, or safe. In other words, the warmth of familiarity is partly a byproduct of your brain being able to coast. When you encounter something new, the brain has to work harder, which can produce a subtle sense of discomfort or wariness. That discomfort is not proof of danger, but it often gets treated as if it were. In the late 1960s, psychologist Robert Zajonc showed people a series of unfamiliar shapes for just a moment each. Later, when asked to rate their liking, participants consistently preferred the shapes they had seen before. They preferred them even when they could not consciously remember seeing them at all. The exposures were so brief that memory did not register, but the preference still took root. This suggests that the safety signal of familiarity forms before conscious thought, not after careful reasoning. The mere exposure effect is a pre-logical vote in favor of whatever your senses have already processed. It explains why a song you initially disliked might grow on you after hearing it on the radio a few times. And it explains why the familiar dish feels safer, even when it has not always been safe. Beyond processing ease, another layer of safety comes from prediction. The brain constantly generates expectations about what will happen next, based on past experience. When you encounter a familiar cue, your internal predictions match reality, creating a comforting sense that the world is making sense. When something unexpected happens, a small prediction error occurs, and the brain pays extra attention, sometimes with a jolt of arousal. That arousal is not necessarily fear, but it can easily blur into anxiety when the situation is already uncertain. Choosing the known path is therefore a way to keep prediction errors small and the nervous system calm. This is why people under stress often grab for comfort food, watch old movies, or listen to the same playlist on repeat. The familiar becomes a behavioral tranquilizer, smoothing the edges of a world that feels overwhelming. Yet the very mechanism that calms you can also shrink the boundaries of your life. If all uncertainty is treated as a threat, Growth becomes something you endure rather than pursue. The person who always orders the same dish avoids a meal they might not like, but also misses a flavor they might love. The student who always studies in the same corner of the library never discovers that another spot has better light or a more inspiring view. The comfort zone is not a fixed place. It is a habit of moving toward what feels easy and away from what feels effortful. Over time, the zone shrinks because experiences that once felt neutral become unfamiliar and thus feel riskier. Anxiety then extends its reach, and the list of safe options grows shorter. Some psychologists describe this as a vicious cycle where the avoidance of uncertainty increases sensitivity to uncertainty. In other words, the more you protect yourself from the unknown, the scarier the unknown becomes. Studies of anxiety show that people who habitually avoid feared situations often end up with more intense fear, not less. You can think of it like a muscle that atrophies from disuse. The ability to tolerate uncertainty can weaken when it is never exercised. Thus, the familiar feels safer not because it is inherently safe, but because your threshold for uncertainty has been lowered by constant retreat. This helps explain why a difficult relationship can feel safer than leaving it, or why staying in a familiar but unfulfilling job can feel safer than exploring a new career. The safety signal is a trick of calibration, not a reliable report on the external world. Infants show this bias early. By 3 months, babies prefer faces that match the race of their primary caregivers. The familiar face looks safer, not because any other face is dangerous, but because the visual system has built a template of what is normal. And that early template influences who a child will later be more comfortable around, shaping social preferences before any conscious belief forms. The mere exposure effect thus becomes a foundation for later social biases, a cognitive shortcut that can narrow the range of people we trust. Even here, the feeling of safety is not a measure of threat, it is a measure of perceptual ease. Now consider the woman at the restaurant one more time, but tonight she is not alone. Her friend scans the menu with curiosity and lands on a dish whose name she cannot pronounce. The friend laughs and says it might be a disaster, or it might be the best thing she has ever eaten. When the meals arrive, the friend's plate is colorful, fragrant, and she takes a bite, and her eyes widen with pleasure. The woman looks at her own familiar plate. It is exactly what she expected, but the taste is muted by a pang of something that is not quite regret. She realizes that the safety she felt was really just the absence of the thrill her friend is experiencing. And in that moment, the safe choice starts to feel more like a quiet kind of loss. The mind has mistaken low effort for safety, and low effort is not the same as low risk. The familiar dish could have more calories, more salt, or be less fresh than something new the kitchen prepared that day. The friend who takes a chance is not being reckless. She is collecting evidence that uncertainty can be navigated. She is widening her comfort zone, while the safer choice is silently narrowing it. The whisper of safety you hear when choosing the familiar is the sound of a prediction error staying silent. But silence is not the same as truth, and comfort is not the same as protection. There is a stunning reversal buried in this everyday pattern. The part of your mind that generates the feeling of safety has no direct access to the outside world's actual dangers. It can only compare the incoming information to stored templates and report how easily they match. So when you feel safe with the familiar, you are mostly feeling the comfort of cognitive ease, not a genuine risk assessment. True safety lies in the world, a sturdy bridge, a well-cooked meal, or a trustworthy person. The mere exposure effect cannot distinguish a sturdy bridge from an old, familiar, but crumbling one. If you have walked across that bridge 100 times without falling, you might forget to check the cables. That is the dark gift of familiarity. It masks the slow accumulation of risk behind a curtain of calm. And so the feeling of safety can become the greatest threat to safety itself. This does not mean that familiar things are always problematic or that you should constantly chase novelty. It means that the sense of safety is a signal to be examined, not an order to be obeyed. You can learn to notice the automatic pull toward the known and ask a simple question. Is this truly safer or just easier? At the restaurant, that question might translate into ordering the special sometimes, even if it means a moment of slight discomfort. The discomfort is not a warning that something is wrong. It is the growing pain of a cognitive muscle being stretched. Over time, stretching that muscle builds a more resilient and expansive life. The woman at the restaurant finishes her meal and watches her friend push her plate away with a satisfied sigh. Next time, she tells herself she will try the dish she cannot pronounce. Even saying those words produces a small flutter in her chest, a mix of excitement and unease. She now recognizes that flutter not as a stop sign, but as a sign that her brain is preparing to learn something new. That is the pivot point where the feeling of safety stops being a cage. We are all navigating the balance between the comfort of prediction and the richness of discovery. And perhaps the deepest safety comes not from always choosing the familiar. It comes from knowing that you can handle the unfamiliar when it arrives. The open menu is a small arena where this balance plays out every day. The question is not which dish is safe, but which choice will allow your world to grow rather than shrink. Because a life too well insulated from uncertainty eventually becomes a life that forgets its own capacity for courage.